He claimed to be the Zodiac, and for years, no one knew who he really was. 5 murders, countless cryptic messages, and a city on edge. But the question remains, who was the Zodiac Killer, and why did he leave behind a trail of terror that still haunts us to this day?
On the night of December 20th, 1968, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were just 2 teenagers on a simple date in Vallejo, California. Their night should have been like any other, but it would turn into a nightmarish event that would define their lives, and the lives of many others in the years to come. The two were parked in their car at Blue Rock Springs Park, enjoying their time together. But a shadow emerged from the darkness, ending their young lives with a gunshot. Betty Lou, just 16, and David, 17, didn't stand a chance. The Zodiac Killer, as he would later come to be known, opened fire on the couple with ruthless precision. He shot David first, killing him instantly, before turning to Betty Lou and firing multiple times. As quickly as he came, the killer disappeared into the night, leaving the scene without a trace. But his terror had only just begun. Just months later, on July 4th, 1969, Darlene and Michael became the Zodiac Killer's next victims. The couple was sitting in a car near a secluded area in Blue Rock Springs Park, much like Betty and David before them. This time, the Zodiac approached their car, again shooting Michael first, and then turning his attention to Darlene. As Michael lay unconscious, Darlene screamed, but the Zodiac's silence and methodical violence only grew colder with each new murder. The Zodiac's modus operandi was disturbingly consistent. Random young couples targeted in remote, quiet places. But it wasn't just the murders that set him apart. It was the thrill he seemed to derive from taunting authorities and the public alike. After each killing, he sent letters to local newspapers filled with cryptic codes and disturbing details that only he knew. These letters served as chilling reminders that the Zodiac Killer was always watching, always lurking just outside of reach. Each victim was more than just a statistic. They were people with families, lives that were snuffed out far too soon. Yet for the Zodiac, they were nothing more than pawns in a deadly game. Victims whose names would forever be linked by the terror he created. The San Francisco Bay Area would never be the same.
It didn't take long for law enforcement to realize something was terribly wrong. After Betty Lou and David's murder, it seemed like a random act of violence. But when Darlene and Michael were attacked just a few months later, the connections started to form. Police began to wonder if they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who was methodically picking off victims with no apparent pattern or motive. But even as suspicions grew, they were still uncertain, lacking any solid leads or evidence that could point them in the right direction. It wasn't until the Zodiac Killer sent his first cryptic letter to the San Francisco Chronicle on July 31st, 1969, that the world truly understood the gravity of the situation. The letter, accompanied by a piece of cipher, was chillingly direct. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for both the Blue Rock Springs Park murders and the murder of another couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard, who had been attacked in Lake Berryessa on September 27, 1969. The letter also promised more killings, adding an eerie threat: "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." The cryptogram was the first of many from the Zodiac, each one more bizarre and convoluted than the last. Each cipher seemed to mock the authorities, as if daring them to crack the code. The killer had found a twisted way to amuse himself while taunting the police, pushing them to prove their worth. As if his murders weren't enough, he now challenged them intellectually. The killer wasn't just a maniac, he was a calculating predator who seemed to enjoy the chaos and fear he created. News outlets were eager to broadcast the letters, and the public was captivated. Local police were under extreme pressure. They had to solve the case, but they didn't have much to work with. There were no reliable eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence that could directly link a suspect to the killings, and the Zodiac's taunting letters seemed to suggest that he was always one step ahead. As the months passed, the Zodiac seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only fear, cryptic letters, and an ever-growing number of victims. For the authorities, it was a race against time, not just to catch him, but to understand him. How could someone like this operate so brazenly? What was his endgame? And most unsettling of all, how many more lives would he claim before he was stopped? By the end of 1969, the Zodiac had become a household name. He was no longer just a killer, he had become a symbol of terror, an enigma wrapped in codes and cryptic messages. His true identity remained a mystery, and every day that passed without an arrest only added to the fear and fascination that surrounded his story. The Zodiac had made his mark on the world, and there was no telling when or if his reign of terror would come to an end.
The more the Zodiac Killer taunted authorities, the more his identity seemed to elude them. His cryptic letters, his uncanny ability to slip through the fingers of law enforcement, and the unsettling calmness in his communication made him a figure of fear, fascination, and confusion. But who was the man behind the mask of the Zodiac? What could drive someone to commit such heinous acts and then revel in the chaos they caused? The Zodiac's background remained a mystery, with little to no evidence to connect him to the crimes. Investigators scrambled to find leads, but all they had were vague descriptions and a chilling pattern of killings. It was clear that the Zodiac had no qualms about blending into society. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was just another person, perhaps a quiet mechanic or a solitary figure living a double life. But behind closed doors, he was a monster, methodically planning his murders and taunting the public with his cryptic letters. The Zodiac's ability to blend in so seamlessly only added to the terror. Unlike other serial killers who often displayed erratic or obvious behavior, the Zodiac seemed cold, calculating, and almost clinical in his actions. There were no obvious signs, no public outbursts, no criminal history that could serve as a clue. He appeared to be an average man, a ghost hiding in plain sight. This unnerving normalcy was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his persona. Some investigators speculated that the Zodiac's early years might hold the key to understanding his dark desires. Childhood trauma, mental illness, a twisted sense of superiority. While there was no concrete evidence to support any of these theories, they remained prevalent in the media and amongst law enforcement. His cryptic letters, filled with veiled threats and a sense of grandeur, suggested that he viewed himself as something larger than life, a predator stalking his prey, unchallenged by the authorities and emboldened by his own delusions. But as the years went on, it became clear that there was something more disturbing at play. The Zodiac was not simply killing for the thrill or the pleasure of it. He was leaving behind clues, baiting the public and law enforcement with riddles that only he could solve. Some experts believed that the Zodiac's obsession with puzzles and ciphers pointed to a mind that craved attention and recognition, someone who needed to be admired for his intelligence as much as feared for his brutality. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer. He was an artist of chaos, a master of manipulation, and he was playing a dangerous game with everyone in his path. Despite the growing number of theories, no one had any definitive answers. The Zodiac remained a ghost, a figure shrouded in mystery whose actions seemed to defy any clear motive or reasoning. Every new letter he sent was another reminder of how elusive he had become. Every murder was another example of his horrifying ability to hide in plain sight. While the killer's identity remained unclear, one thing was certain: the Zodiac had become an enigma, a puzzle that refused to be solved. And as the world tried to understand him, the more his power over them grew. As the years passed, the Zodiac's presence in the Bay Area seemed to fade, but the questions remained. Would he ever be caught? Or was he always one step ahead, pulling the strings of fear from the shadows? As the body count mounted, the hunt for the Zodiac Killer became a national obsession. The case was unlike anything the Bay Area had ever seen. Each new murder seemed more brutal, more terrifying than the last, and the cryptic letters that followed kept authorities on edge, unsure of how to proceed. For law enforcement, the investigation was an overwhelming challenge. Every lead seemed to evaporate into thin air, every witness account blurred by confusion, and every piece of evidence led to dead ends. Despite the growing pressure, detectives couldn't ignore the chilling reality. The Zodiac seemed to be taunting them at every turn. After the attack at Lake Berryessa, the killer boldly called the police himself, detailing the crime and providing a sense of cold indifference that unsettled the entire police force. He even sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle in which he took credit for the stabbing and included more ciphers, further mocking the authorities' inability to solve them. For the detectives, the ciphers were both a clue and a puzzle. The Zodiac seemed to be daring them to crack his code, offering them a glimpse into his mind, but leaving behind just enough complexity to ensure they never reached the truth. Some of these ciphers, particularly the famous 340-character cipher, were unsolved for years, leading to frustration within the investigation. The Zodiac had planned this from the beginning. He wasn't just killing, he was playing a game, and the game had only just begun. Detectives, local law enforcement, and even private citizens worked tirelessly to decode the messages. While some were able to decipher portions, no one could piece together the full code. But the obsession with cracking these ciphers became part of the Zodiac's power. He controlled the narrative, and everyone around him was forced to play by his rules. Meanwhile, the public's growing fear began to fuel further speculation and paranoia. With each new letter and cryptic message, the Zodiac became a larger-than-life figure, almost like a mythical villain in a horror story. And to make matters worse, there were reports that the killer had been spotted multiple times, but he always managed to slip away, leaving behind only confusion and dread. As the Zodiac continued to elude capture, the investigation became one of the most frustrating cases in the history of criminal law enforcement. Every time a suspect emerged, they were quickly ruled out. No forensic evidence, no reliable eyewitness testimony, and no solid leads. It was as if the killer had vanished into the ether. But then, in 1970, something changed. A breakthrough of sorts. The Zodiac's letters began to reveal a small yet crucial detail. In one of his communications, he mentioned a symbol, the infamous cross circle, drawing attention to the fact that he had used it during several of the murders. This symbol, which had been dismissed as meaningless at first, began to stand out as a possible clue. It was the Zodiac's signature, his mark, and it was something that no one had noticed before. With this new angle, investigators began to shift their focus. They reviewed old crime scene photos, re-interviewed witnesses, and started to look at the case with fresh eyes. Despite their best efforts, the Zodiac remained a ghost. His taunts continued, but as the years passed, his letters slowed. The killer had faded into obscurity, leaving behind only a handful of unsolved ciphers, a series of grisly murders, and an endless trail of questions. The investigation into the Zodiac's identity became a tangled web of dead ends, theories, and constant frustration. As the killer's letters stopped and his attacks ceased, law enforcement began to wonder if the Zodiac had simply moved on, or if perhaps he had grown bored of the game. Either way, the investigation would continue, but the chances of finding the killer seemed to grow slimmer by the year. And then in 1974, the Zodiac disappeared entirely. The public and the media would go on speculating for decades, but the answers remained just out of reach. The Zodiac was gone, leaving behind a legacy of fear, confusion, and haunting unanswered questions. The investigation, like the killer himself, was shrouded in mystery, never quite resolving into the closure that everyone had desperately hoped for. The truth seemed to be buried under years of silence, and with every passing year, the Zodiac Killer became a ghost story, a myth wrapped in unsolved crimes, a name that would haunt the Bay Area forever.
Despite years of frustration and dead ends, the Zodiac Killer's case remained an obsession for law enforcement. In the 1970s, as the Zodiac's reign of terror seemed to end, investigators shifted their focus to potential suspects. One of the most prominent candidates was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who had a history of violent behavior. He had lived near some of the Zodiac's crime scenes, and some of his actions and statements made him a strong suspect. Allen was known to have made vague, chilling comments to friends about being the Zodiac, and a search of his home uncovered some Zodiac-like symbols and items that seemed to connect him to the crimes. However, despite this circumstantial evidence, there was no direct proof linking Allen to the killings. In 1974, a handwriting analysis failed to match his writing to the Zodiac's letters, and DNA testing later ruled him out as the killer. In the years that followed, various other suspects were considered, but none could be definitively tied to the crimes. With no new murders or letters, the Zodiac's silence only deepened the mystery. DNA evidence became a tool in cold cases, but by the time forensic technology advanced, the killer was long gone. Despite the continued investigation and speculation, no one was ever arrested or brought to trial for the Zodiac killings. The case remains one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer mysteries, with theories and suspects still swirling, but the killer's identity and his fate remain uncertain to this day.
The Zodiac Killer's disappearance left a lasting impact. While the killings stopped in the early 1970s, the fear and unanswered questions remained. Victims' families lived with unresolved grief, while law enforcement continued to revisit old evidence, but no breakthroughs ever came. The Zodiac's cryptic letters and ciphers mocked police, leaving a trail of frustration and terror. The case became a public fascination, with books, documentaries, and films perpetuating the mystery of the Zodiac. He became a symbol of the unknown, a killer who vanished without a trace. His legacy is defined by terror, a chilling reminder that some killers slip through the cracks of justice. Though his identity remains unsolved, the Zodiac's story continues to haunt. Will we ever uncover the truth? Only time will tell. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling true crime documentaries.